The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. This is Rebecca Skloot. She is a writer that mostly writes about science and medicine. She was born September 19th, 1972. Her first book she wrote and published is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and it was one of the best-selling new books in 2010. This is Henrietta Lacks. She went to Johns Hopkins Hospital because of pains in her stomach. The doctor's diagnosis was that she had a cancerous tumor in her abdomen, and without her knowing, they took a test sample. They tried to keep her alive and treat her as best as they can, but then she sadly died. But when she did, they asked the family to do an autopsy so they can take more samples. The scientists found out how to keep the cells alive, and they put them in vials to sell to other scientists to test medicine and test what happens to cells in many situations or when something happens to them. Cells were sold for $10,000 or $100. The scientists found many cures and vaccines using her cells, which benefited everyone because we could cure people. Then you couldn't do that before. The scientists also hope to find a cure to cancer that can save someone who was just like Henrietta. The spiritual and religious issues surrounding all of the living tissue from people who already died is that it was mortally wrong. The doctors took samples without asking, knowing that the patients might die soon. They sometimes asked for consent, but it was mostly asked to white patients. And they didn't ask black patients because back in their day, they were racist and they didn't have to really ask consent. It wasn't part of the law. The family didn't know at first that her cells were alive, but then when they found out, they thought she was fully alive and that they can see her in person. But they found out it was just cells. The family doesn't like that they didn't get asked to use the cells for studies, and they believed that she would be happy with what the scientists did because she was a very nice woman and wanted to help everyone. If Henrietta was a white person who was in middle class, they probably would have asked consent before they took her cells. They probably would share her profit that they make off of the cells, and because they respected white people back in that day. And if her family knew it would happen, they wouldn't really be angry at the hospital, and they would all have good education and probably would talk about her mother, and it wouldn't have been so hard to get the Tuskegee things about Henrietta. The Tuskegee experiment started in 1932 when they didn't have a cure to syphilis. The men were promised free medical care if they let the scientists do experiments. They lied to the men and said they were checking for bad blood. Then they injected them with syphilis. They studied them until they died, even though they could easily get rid of it because they found a cure. The patients only were given painkillers for the pain. The men were treated wrong like Henrietta and her family, all because of persuasion and the color of their skin. They tested them and used them for scientific studies to find new medicines. I really think that the Tuskegee experiment was way wronger than Henrietta's, because at least Henrietta wasn't a self-inflicted disease, and it's just really inhumane to watch someone die slowly in pain.